Hello everyone, it is Caitlin, and today I'm going to teach you how to put in hooks and eyes in your mid-19th century clothing. So hooks and eyes are just one way to close up a bodice. You also see buttons and buttonholes in this time period, with hooks and eyes starting out as more common in the 1830s and buttons and buttonholes slowly taking over by the 1865-1870 range. There are lots of ways you can use hooks and eyes in your mid-19th century dress closures, and we'll take a look at a few of those today. First, of course, you can use just hooks and eyes to close up your bodice. Second, you can use hooks and eyes to close up your bodice, but then put decorative fake buttons over top to make it look like it closes with buttons and buttonholes, but without doing the buttonholes. I particularly like this style because I can have the decoration of buttons without the fuss of having to do buttonholes. You can also, of course, just do buttons and buttonholes. But we're not going over buttons and buttonholes today, we're just doing hooks and eyes, so we're going to focus a little bit less on that. You can also have a dress that closes up with buttons and buttonholes all the way down, but from bust to waist does hooks and eyes for extra security. You see this more in the later 1860s and the early 1870s. First, let's take a look at some research to determine how common hooks and eyes were on bodices. We're going to take a very small sample of 20 dresses per decade, from 1830 to 1865, and just show some stats on how common hooks and eyes were in bodices. I used three categories: just hooks and eyes, just buttons and buttonholes, and just hooks and eyes with decorative buttons. I did not include dresses that lace shut, and I only included day dresses. I had a very hard time finding pictures of originals that showed the real inside, so I really couldn't tell if any of them had hooks and eyes in addition to button and buttonholes, so that's something you'd have to research further. I know I have several originals that do both with the hooks and eyes and the buttons and buttonholes, so it was common. I just don't know how common, and we're not going to use that for the study. I also did not take into account the fashionableness of the dress, the age of the wearer, the area of manufacture, fiber of garment, and etc. So the following graphs are very basic. From 1830 to 1839, out of the 20 dresses that I looked at, 18 had hooks and eyes, and 2 had buttons and buttonholes. And since 18 plus 2 equals 20, 0 of them had hooks and eyes and then decorative buttons. Now for the 1840s. Out of the 20 1840s dresses that I looked at, 18 had hooks and eyes, and 2 had decorative buttons over hooks and eyes. But those buttons were more like tassels almost going down the front of the dress. Out of the 20 1850s dresses, 9 had hooks and eyes, 5 had buttons and buttonholes, and 6 had decorative buttons on top of hooks and eyes. And finally, I only did 1860 to 1865, so it is not a full decade. From 1860 to 1865, 4 dresses had hooks and eyes, 8 had buttons and buttonholes, and 8 had decorative buttons over top of hooks and eyes. So that was very basic, but hopefully that helps you decide whether to use hooks and eyes on your gown. So with the numerical research out of the way, let's look at some pretty original gowns. This is an 1860s bodice from my collection. It just closes with hooks and eyes, and these are black metal on this original. In a moment, we'll take a look at an original that has brass hooks and eyes, so both are correct. I have not seen any originals that use nickel or the silver one, so just keep that in mind while searching for hooks and eyes to use. Modern hooks and eyes are made differently from period ones, but that is often unavoidable unless you can find old stock of antique hooks and eyes. So modern ones will often have a little hook underneath this part to kind of catch the eye, which keeps it from finding its way out and undoing itself. Period ones, you don't see that on. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So on this original there are 14 hooks and 14 eyes. The hooks are on the right side of the bodice and fold over the left side, which have the eyes. So let's measure them. The hooks are about ½ inch long and about ¼ inch wide at their widest part. The ones on this original kind of vary. They're wider, about 1 inch apart at the very top, and by the time you get to the waist, about ¾ inch, and even further, at the very waist, they're about ½ inch apart. I do find that they didn't necessarily measure how far apart to put their hooks and eyes. It seems like every other hook is different, set differently. So it doesn't necessarily matter if they're all perfectly correct or perfectly 1 inch apart. You don't see that on originals, and often you do need more fitting across the bust and the waist than you do up here, so you can get away with using less up here than you can further down. Notice how the seamstress did not cut off the thread after each hook and eye. She left it in. I see this on all of my originals that have hooks and eyes. They don't cut off the thread, they just jump from one hook to the next. It is faster to do, and you see it on originals very frequently. And so you can see how she did it. There's about a 1/2 inch from the edge. She put her hooks, the very top of the hook. On this side, she folded everything down, and she just put the eyes on the very edge, so they do peep out just slightly. But when you close them, because there's a 1/2 inch here, it does cover everything and you don't have any gaps. So you don't want to put the hooks at the very edge where there will be a gap. You want to have a little bit of a fold over so you can hide that. Next we're going to take a look at a bodice that has functional hooks and eyes to close the bodice, but decorative buttons. Alright, this is another bodice from my collection, a little bit later. It has a peplum. This is probably 1866. This is a little bit later than that. It was actually originally a much earlier bodice, maybe about 1860, 1862 or so, and then it was redone a little bit later to make it more fashionable. So it looks like she has buttons, but when you turn it inside out, you see that there are no buttonholes. She just did hooks and eyes. Again, this is my favorite way to do it because you don't have to do those stinking buttonholes. So on this one, we have the hooks on the left side and the eyes on the right side. And these eyes are stuck in between the lining and the silk. So they turn the silk in, they turn the lining in. So the last one just folded the fabric over just like it did on the other side and stitched the eyes on the back. What she did is she folded the lining, stitched the eyes to the lining, then folded the fashion fabric in and whipped the edge so you don't see the bottom of the eyes. So both ways are correct. Now of course these are brass hooks and eyes. Now on this side she did the same thing as we saw on the other. She actually hid her hooks all the way in, so she made a little hole with an awl and stuck the hook in there, stitched it onto the lining so you don't see the stitching on the front at all, so you cannot tell that there are any hooks and eyes on this one. You don't have to do that, but you can. You can also just put the buttons over top the hooks and eyes and just hide the stitches that way. So it's very hard to measure hers. Hers are a little bit smaller than the last one. A little over about 3/8 of an inch long, and at their widest part, still about 1/4 inch. I do want to mention very quickly that I've never seen the bars being used instead of the eyes. I've only ever seen little circular eyes, not the little straight bars. Modern stores sell them, but as far as I can tell, they aren't period. Now I've seen pictures of thread bars, basically embroidering the bars instead of using the eyes. But it is tedious, and so I don't usually do that. But as far as the metal parts, I've only seen the eyes. Just know that it's an option. So now let's look at a bodice with hooks and eyes, plus buttons and buttonholes. Here's a later 1860s bodice. She used these lovely pearl and brass buttons on her left side, and some, for Victorians, sloppy buttonholes on her right. They're better than mine, but compared to other Victorian buttonholes I've seen, they're not as neat, and so I refer to them as sloppy. Her hooks and eyes are brass, her eyes being on her left side with the buttons, and her hooks being on the right side with the buttonholes. Now you can occasionally find brass hooks and eyes for sale. There's a place I will link below that does sell brass hooks and eyes. They are expensive, but they are very, very close reproductions. And so if you're wanting something that's very correct, that you can turn inside out and look almost like an original, that's what you're going to want to do. So let's measure her hooks and eyes. They are about 1/2 inch long again, and about 1/4 inch wide. She only has 4 of them, and it's just really from the waist part, really to kind of get this little V part to fit well. I also see them on a couple of originals from the bust, so where the dart ended, all the way down to the waist. Her eyes were set on just the same way the first one did, which was just to turn over both ends, not even bothering to tack the rest of this down, using just the buttons and the eyes to kind of hold this and keep it from flopping up. But they are about 1/4 inch that way, and about 1/4, actually they're more like 3/8 of an inch that way. Between 1/4 and 3/8, more like 3/8. Now I do have an original bodice that has the hooks and eyes just like this with the buttons and buttonholes, and it's a straight across bodice, so it's not because that she has a V that she did this. You can do it on a round bodice as well. So from this point, we're going to go straight into the how-to portion of this video. I have some actual brass hooks and eyes with me today. These I bought on eBay, and they are size large. So the hooks are about, not quite 1/2 inch long, and about 1/4 inch wide. And the eyes are about a little over 1/4 inch long and wide, about 3/8 of an inch. So they're roughly the size of the original ones, just a little bit bigger. So from my experience, all modern hook and eye manufacturers have their own sizing system, and it doesn't match up with anyone else's. So do kind of pay attention to more to measurements than to size. So I have bodices that have hooks on the left and eyes on the right, and also vice versa. That could be a left versus right hand thing, or possibly a getting dressed myself versus having someone else there to help me get dressed thing. I don't have a large enough personal collection to really hone on which is more popular at this point, so I do what is more comfortable for me. I have dresses that do it both ways, but I personally prefer, since I generally dress myself, to do hooks on the right and eyes on the left side of the bodice. So here I have a completed bodice edge, which is different than what we saw in the originals, as this is a reproduction 1830s bodice, not an 1850s, 1860s bodice. 30s bodices usually had the front cut on the bias, so using the selvage edge was not quite done yet. Now I could have very well folded this edge over and tacked it down to cover the raw edge, similar to the 50s and 60s bodices we saw, but I like the piping detail on the front, and you do see this in the 30s, and I don't always like messing around with folding over a bias edge anyway. If you are doing a front opening 30s bodice, feel free to either fold over the edge as we saw before, or to use piping to finish this edge. Anything later, or for a back closing bodice, even in the 30s, you're going to want to use the selvage like the originals we saw, or at least a very straight edge. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. Now I've already put pins in where I want the hooks and eyes to go. This is very much personal preference. You do tend to see fewer closures, say one at the top, one at the fullest part of the bust, and one or two at the waist for the 1830s, and more frequent closures as you go through the decade. Now this is a reproof 1830s bodice, as I said, and I do have the hooks and eyes quite close together, 1.5 inches apart in fact. This is not nearly as common as just a few closures in this time period, but this is what works for my body. If you're doing 1830s and your bodice fits well with just one hook at each the neck, the bust, and the waist, do that and you'll be far more typical of the period. Also, my hooks and eyes are fairly equal distance apart, but yours don't have to be, particularly if you have a very full bust. You may want to have more hooks and eyes across the bust and fewer near the neck and waist. Do whatever you need to improve the fit of your gown. You see a wide variety of space between hooks and eyes, even on the same bodice. So for thread, you're really going to want something a little bit thicker than your normal sewing thread generally. I cannot find my thicker thread that matches this bodice, so we're going to use our regular sewing thread instead today. But really, a lot of the originals show a thicker thread. Think like almost buttonhole twist. Now, as we saw with the originals, we can sew the hooks on top, or we can have pushed the hook through the fabric from the lining side so it's mostly hidden. I'm going to lay them on top of the lining as I've already finished this edge. So I'm going to start at the bottom. It doesn't really matter where you start. I'm going to take my hook. Now, this bodice edge will overlap, so take that into account. When you sew in the eyes, usually the eyes are fairly close to top, so you need to account for your gap on the hook side. And so we're going to take our thread and we're going to make just a few passes. You do want to try to cover the whole loop, holding it down with your thumb and then with your ring finger on the other side. And then I'm going to do the same thing on this side. And just moving across, so starting at one end of the hook and just moving our way across. Oops, that took up all my hooks and eyes with it. Okay, now what we're going to do, now I did take a bite out of the lining and the fashion fabric for those two, so there is like a little bit of a mark on that side. Sometimes what I'll do is only do like a 2 or 3 on the front side and do the rest just through the lining. That's usually what's better to do. But on this one I'm only going to take the lining and go up kind of towards the hook part and just make a few passes through the lining to hold that hook down in place. Okay, now we're ready for the next one. So I'm going to put this where it belongs, hold it down, and just jump. And I put the first one through the fashion fabric and the lining. I'm going to try just to do the lining for the next several, so you don't see it through the fashion fabric. Again, just starting at one end and going all the way over. And I'm going to make a tiny little bite of the fashion fabric on that side. And same thing. Trying to bite just the lining. Particularly since my thread doesn't really match my bodice, I'm going to try to make fewer passes over to the fashion fabric and try to get most of them just on the lining. And same thing, just do the lining up here. And when I run out of thread, it's fine. I just, add a new thread and keep going. There we go. There's two. And on those two, you can see how they're really not noticeable. Because there's the first one I did with, all the little marks on them. But you can see them on that side. But this one, you can only see tiny little marks here, really 4 that I did on the fashion fabric, and they're very hard to see. You may not even be able to see them on camera. A little bit. So, yeah, just tiny little bites of fashion fabric, and it'll help you keep those hidden. Alright, eyes. So here's the eye side. Now again, there's a few different ways to do this. You can put them on the inside lining or sandwich them between your lining and fashion fabric. Either way is shown as originals, just as we saw. Do whatever you like best. If you sandwich, you only need to sew the loops to the lining and then whip the lining to the fashion fabric together around the edges. But this edge is already piped, so I clearly cannot sandwich it, so we're going to be doing it the other way. Again, the process is basically the same as with the hooks. I'm going to put them right here. And same thing. Except I'm putting them within this piping, so I probably won't be going all the way down to the fashion fabric. That and not. See if I can get that out of my needle. There you go. But again, several passes just around the loop, holding it together with your ring finger and thumb. Okay, and then we're going to do it the second loop, or the third loop really, right really where the two little loops end. Same thing. So just 2 or 3, not very many. You really just want to keep it from, flipping up on you. Alright. There you go. There's one. Let's do the next one. Now we're going to do the other way that we saw in the originals to put in hooks and eyes. So the one that used the awl. I'm not working on a bodice currently, and I need to get this thing filmed and edited, so we're going to use scrap fabric today. So this is my lining of the bodice. So I use my selvage edge like we would on a bodice, and it's just the lining so far. So we're going to go ahead and put our hooks in, just right here. So same thing, I have my folded edge. We're going to figure out where we want our hooks, and we're going to go all the way through both layers. Sew them in as normal. And we're still going to go through here, although it doesn't matter as much. And we'll put our next hook on there. Again, just jumping as we did before. And there we go. So we're only going to sew, oops, I missed that. That goes underneath the hook. And I'm only going to sew on 2 hooks and eyes today because this is scrap fabric. So then we have our hooks that are on our lining. So now here's our fabric edge. This is some silk taffeta. This is our dress. And look, there's even kind of a neckline cut out for us. Isn't that nice? So we're going to put our lining inside our bodice, and it's going to be folded over, okay? So you got to figure out where the tip, so say I need to fold it over this much. We need to measure where we need to put our hole, and that's going to be about where this part of the hook is, so the very edge of the hook. So I'm going to use my awl, maybe, and this is where it needs to be. So very gently, we're going to press a hole. You don't want to cut this. You absolutely do not want to cut this. Cutting weakens the fibers. You want to push them carefully to the side, because if you break them or if you cut them, this is going to ravel. It won't ravel if you just push it, which is why we're using the awl. Let me figure out how far apart this one was. Right here. Okay, we're going to do that all the way down, or for me, just 2 of them, very gently. Okay. And now we're just going to put the hook through the hole. There we go. Okay. And then you can press it down and you have your hooks. There you go. Just like that. So that is very similar to what we saw in the original. That one had the lining coming down further and this closer to the edge. Sometimes it's hard to get in all through that selvage edge, so I like to put mine a little bit further up when I do this method. But that's a very common way to see it. And this is nice because you don't see any hook and eye damage on this side of the bodice itself. This is clear, but it's also very stable. Nothing's going to happen to it. So these aren't going to come out, they're not going to pull, it's not going to be weird. This is a very nice way of doing hooks. Well, let's try the eyes. We're going to do the eyes down on this end. And again, pretend that it's the bodice. The only thing is, now, we're going to do it on this side. So we folded in the lining. So we're going to do it on this side. So there's the fold. The fold is going to go in this time. Instead of going out, it's going to go in. We're going to do our eyes on this side. So I'm going to take this end, just as we did before. Just barely poke that large loop out. And sew away through both layers several times. And I find this way you don't have to actually do the sewing on the big loop. Just do it on the small loops. And you can do it on the big loop. You just don't have to. Okay. Do another one. So now we have our eye sewn in. Very similar to the way we did it before, we just did it on the lining this time as opposed to the fashion fabric and the lining. Move this out of the way. And so now we have our bodice edge again. We're going to fold it in. And remember, this is just, it depends on your pattern. So some of them might have them folded over 1 inch, some of them 2 inches. It depends on how much your pattern allowed for. So we'll say my pattern allowed for this. Work around the top here, and we're going to put our lining and our fashion fabric right up together, and we're going to take our thread, let's start over here, and we're going to whip them together with tiny little stitches. So just catching the very edge both the fashion fabric and the lining. Going through the hook, or the eye, go through the eye, and continue sewing little tiny stitches all the way down the front of your bodice. And so there you have it. That's what it looks like from the front. So again, you don't have that stitching showing. You just have this little bit here. You have a thread that matches your fabric. You're not going to see that at all. And of course, it's going to get covered with the hooks in just a moment anyway when you try it on. So that is the second way to put in hooks and eyes. So using the hidden method is what I call it. So there's like the typical method that I usually use, and I call this, like this is the hidden eye method, and this is the hidden hook method, because you don't see the stitches at all from the front side. So those are both very valid, period correct ways to put in hooks and eyes, and you can use whichever one you prefer for your particular project. Thank you so much for joining me today as we learn 2 different methods of putting in hooks and eyes on our reproduction bodices. Please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Have a fantastic week, and I will see you back here on Monday.